Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Paul Meitner coming to you from St. Paul's First Lutheran Church here in North Hollywood. Coming to you from our 13th session of Luther's Reformation. Today we're looking at the Schwaermer and the nun, domestic turmoil and domestic bliss. The years, perhaps even harder than the years leading up to the Diet of Worms, is the years after he gets back to Wittenberg for a couple of reasons. Between 1525 and 1522 and 1525, a new front opens up against Luther, and in many ways, it's a much more difficult front to deal with. The radical Reformation and the idea that to have anything Catholic, we must get rid of all of it. A complete social upheaval, almost a socialistic vision, an apocalyptic vision where we must take the entire existing order of everything and throw it on its head, kill all the princes, kill all the bishops, and it will usher us into this grand new age. And of course, this is always dangerous and something very anti-scriptural and something very anti-Lutheran. And Luther, was stressing to people what I fought for was freedom for the gospel. He says, I'm content with that. I'm not talking about freedom from kings or freedom from paying taxes or freedom from the obligations that Christ our Lord actually endows us with. I'm not looking for that kind of freedom. That would be horrendous. I'm looking for a freedom to preach the truth in its fullness, to live the truth in its fullness. And so what we're going to look at today is that new conflict that opens up on Luther's left, if you will. He will always have these dealings with the Catholic Church, and there will always that threat to his life, and always be that attack coming from the right, if you will, from the establishment, if you will. But then there's also this attack from this progressive, merging of theological freedom with some sort of socialistic freedom, and he will take that on as well. We will end today by looking, however, at how during these years of great turmoil and trouble, Luther does find some sense of peace and some sense of domestic bliss by the Lord bringing a special woman into his life, Katharina von Bora, who will be his wife, will be his helpmeet the last 21 years of his life, and will bear him a number of children, and will give him a real sense of peace and a real sense of a joy amidst all these storms that he has to weather his whole life. But let's get into it. One thing we have to begin with is we have to talk a little bit about the social unrest of the 16th century. Again, up to this point, we've talked about politics, we've talked about religion, but we do have to bring in the social aspect of this. We have to bring in some of the anthropological problems that are going on. Here we have a typical 15th century, 16th century farmer. Now remember, most people are farmers. Peasants are farmers. They have to work the land. The closest thing I think we would have to the idea of a medieval peasant in our history would be that of the black sharecropper following the Civil War. That's about the closest thing you can have. Maybe perhaps the indentured servants of early history of our country, but that's the closest thing that we can probably get to. Now, what you have to understand is that when things are good, it's not great, but you have a sense of comfort, you have a sense of freedom. The idea simply here was that you paid your Lord for protection. He gave you the land upon which you lived. You returned to him a portion of your income in return for that protection and that right, that safety. Typical social contract. But by the 16th century, with the rise of the merchant class, the middle class, with the rise of the free market, and with the further corruption of the church, you find that the peasant, the farmer, is being squeezed on every side. And there's a couple reasons for the squeezing. Historically, we have what's known as the Little Ice Age. And the Little Ice Age really has wreaked havoc on the growing potential of any given land. For instance, when the Vikings first came to Greenland, it was green. It was a good growing crop. The wine was grown in England. You had very good conditions for growth and for good harvests and large harvests. What happens is the little ice age sets in, and that really, really, really shrinks the growing season. It causes famine, it causes devastation. On top of that, you have the Black Plague, which rips through in the 14th and 15th century, decimating as much as even 50% of certain parts of Europe. And people would think that's a good thing, but it's not, because there's fewer people to work the land, and yet more is required of them. And so by the time you get to Luther's day, you have a number of things that are pressing in upon your normal average farmer. You have all kinds of things pressing in. For instance, we'll start with the merchants. The merchants were charging criminal rates of interest in money lending. And this is a time, there's no relief. We live in a country that's nice enough and still has enough influence to realize we're going to give people some money. Now, understand, when the government gives us our 4,000, 5,000, whatever, how many $1,000s they give us during this kind of COVID-19, they're not doing that out of the goodness of their heart. That's why they want you to think they're doing it, but that's not why they're simply doing it. It's not simply out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing that in the hopes that by giving you that money, people aren't going to riot. They're not going to rebel against the government, because they understand that you take Joe, average person, you take his ability to support his family, he's going to get desperate, and he gets enough of those people to get desperate, he's going to throw things up in a turmoil, and it's going to be more costly to us, and we don't want that. And so the government, as much and as big as this bailout has been, it is preferable to arson, mayhem, bloodshed in the streets. Okay, but at this time there is no such thing. It's not even thought of. There's no relief during this time, and they are lending money to these poor farmers at criminal rates of interest. Just to give you an idea of that, what's going on, if you ever read the story Under the Lion's Paw by Sean Marlowe, I'm sorry, I thought that was by Willa Cather, but now I realize it's not by Willa Cather. But Willa Cather touches on these subjects as well. But Under the Lion's Paw is a wonderful short story which deals with an immigrant who's come to this country, and a man says, well, it's a broken down farm. If you work it hard, I'll give you a good deal on it. And he works so hard. He brings the farm up, and it's good and it's wonderful. And then when he goes to pay for it, he charges 6 times the amount, because, well, it's worth so much more. Well, it's worth so much more because I put all my life and sweat into it. And the banker is just going to squeeze him even more. And it ends in a very almost violent way. But you get a good sense, if you ever read that short story from our own American history, a little bit of what was happening to these people. And you can imagine, these people are dressing wealthy and living high on the hog, and meanwhile Joe Farmer is barely scraping by. You can understand why just human greed, human envy is going to play into the fact, not to mention the fact that it seems radically unfair. On top of that, you have the problem of taxes that are owed to your lord. You owe your lord taxes for living on the land, and you have to pay him a portion of the produce. Now, this system will actually last well into the 19th century, 20th century. If anybody watches Downton Abbey, still the main source of income in Downton Abbey is the revenue from the land that they own. So you own revenue to your lord, you own revenue to them. But the other thing that is also here is that there was forced military service. Remember, we've been talking about these diets and how these electors had to provide soldiers. Well, where did these soldiers? They didn't shake out of their sleeve. Many of them did not have professional armies. They may have small mercenary forces, but in order to meet a levy of troops, they'd walk into town and say, "Okay, you're going to go fight." Well, these men would go and fight, but who's working the land during that time? The land may not be able to be worked during that time, and when you add on top of that the plague coming through, or any other famine, any other problems, you're really behind the 8 ball. You still owe your taxes. One of my favorite scenes from the movie Braveheart is where the Scottish peasants, see this fight that's going to happen. They're going to get slaughtered by the English, and this Scottish actor says, "Well, I'm not going to die for these guys just so that they can increase their own lands and their holdings and have to pay them more taxes. Forget this. Let's go home." So that's a very accurate thought of a peasant during this time. I just have a picture of Vladimir Lenin here. I don't really believe that the Russian Revolution would have taken place had it not been for the crushing taxes that the Romanov dynasty put upon uh, the, the Russian people, on top of which you add the military demands. People are pulled away from their homes and they have to go fight in that war, and the war is run. It's like three Marx Brothers as generals. That discontent, I believe, led to the success of the Russian Revolution. And finally, you have the church. There was forced tithing in the church, so by the time you were done, there was very little of the pie left for the actual man who grew the food. There were charges from everything to marriage to baptism to burials. Frederick Maximilian I, Holy Redemptor, used to refer to the Rhine as Preacher's Alley, and that was not a comment on how godly the people were who lived along the Rhine, but how there were preachers up and down the Rhine taking their cut from every one of the people there. They got their cut. The clergy was seen in many ways as their own robber barons. They charged from everything. You want your kid baptized, pay up. If you want to get married, pay up. If you want to get buried, pay up. If you want, and there just was, there's always 1,000 different ways they could charge you for the grace of God that they wanted to deliver to you. And that's something that it still is a problem today. For instance, I just have this. This is from canon law in the Catholic Church. In the U.S., most tribunals charge anywhere from $200 to $1,000 for adjudicating a standard nullity case. These fees are typically payable over time, and they are a means of having the fees reduced or eliminated in case of financial hardship. So if you're divorced and you want to get remarried in the Catholic Church, you have to go through annulment. And annulment, well, it's going to cost you $200 to $1,000 and perhaps even more. I'm always curious to see what some of the Kennedys paid for their annulments. But there's always money. A funny story from my vicar year. I vicared at Woodlawn Lutheran Church in West Dallas, Wisconsin, and I noticed that in our congregation there, when I was vicaring, there were lots of Polish names. I mean, really non-Lutheran names. Krzyzewski and names like that. 18 syllables and one vowel. And I asked the pastor at the time, and they said, "Well, how do we get all these Polish names?" And I mean, these are really Polish names. And he said, "Well, a lot of them came in the 1930s because during the Depression, the Catholic Church, St. Aloysius, was still demanding that if you would not get your child baptized until you were up on your offerings." And you had people who had been out of work for years. How are we ever supposed to pay them with these kids, and they're outside of the church and the grace of God, and they're desperate? But then, their local Lutheran neighbor says, "Well, my pastor will baptize them for free." And they did, and they married him and buried him. And so a lot of these names came into the Lutheran Church during that time for this. But it gives you, in our own history, we see little bits and pieces of this. But you can see how the local peasant is really being squashed and hard at this time, and he's very unhappy. And there are a lot of peasants who are very, very unhappy. And that leads us to the Bundshuh. Now the Bundshuh is this symbol, and you'll notice in this picture, there's this boot. That's the peasant's boot, and the peasant's boot is a sign of social unrest. It's kind of a rallying cry. It's a rallying cry to bring this sort of usury to heel, to put the princes back in their places, to cut these swindlers and cheats and tax collectors. Very popular is the story of Jesus driving out the money changers in the temple during this time, and they seek that. In fact, even at Worms, people had placards of the Bundshuh all posted up one night, and that made Charles V a little bit nervous because he did not need to have a rebellion on his hands during that time. And so this is a sign of fomenting unrest. A little ditty that I came across in my preparation. So, what kind of business is this messed for priests and mighty candle prince? A little German ditty that people used to sing. And basically, the idea of fighting the man or fighting the power, it is not something that started with the Russian Revolution or something that started with the 1960s revolutionary counterculture. It's been a standard phrase for those who are truly oppressed. Now, what I would say about this is these people were truly oppressed. I want to stress that. People who seek victimhood in the United States today, most of them are not true victims. Most of them are just whiners, in my opinion. But these people are really true victims. These people are really truly knuckled under. There are people who truly suffer, and I think that the distinction between who truly suffers is pretty obvious. You know, I don't feel sorry for people who are going to Harvard and call themselves oppressed. I mean, if you get into Harvard, you're not oppressed. You go to Yale, you're not oppressed. I feel sorry for the guy who's working 6 jobs and is barely making ends meet, or the guy who is, you know, simply arrested for the color of his skin, not because he's done anything wrong. We have a lot of people, however, in our country today who claim oppression and victimhood when they are anything but oppressed or victims. But these people, I want to get across, these people were true victims. They were true people who were suffering and really being under the lion's paw, to use that phrase, from American literature. Now, this does not simply stay in the realm of possibility. It becomes a real reality during the failed Knights Revolt. Now, here's our old friend Franz von Sickingen. He and another knight, Ulrich von Hutten, were early supporters of humanistic learning and also the Lutheran Reformation. These guys pledged knights to Luther's cause. We're going to protect you. We're going to back you up. In fact, Sickingen, his early claim to fame is people are threatening a biblical humanist, Melanchthon's uncle, Johannes Reuchlin. And Sickingen basically says, you know, you either let Reuchlin go and leave him alone, or my knights will come in and we'll run roughshod of you. And people were scared of that thought, and they let Reuchlin go. So this guy, that kind of goes to Sickingen's head. But they begin to see themselves as the liberators of Europe. These guys are knights, and the age of the knight has come to an end, and they want a reflowering of knighthood, if you will. And so they look at their castles as refuges of righteousness, a new place of learning. Basically, it's a new crusade, okay? And our crusade will not be for the holy end; it will be for the recovery of biblical learning, recovery for, you know, we will be the defenders of that. We will be the people who provide and cut down any force that would stand against you, be it a pope, be it the Holy Roman Emperor. We will raise our swords to protect the true learning, the godly learning. Again, there is this almost messianic view of their life that they are going to provide for this. They are the new Constantine. They are the new Knights Templar. In 1522, they gather a large army. This is while Luther's at the Wartburg, and they lay siege to the city of Trier to overthrow the Archbishop of Trier, who's gotten into a row with Sickingen at the beginning of what he thinks is their glorious revolution. Doesn't turn out well for Sickingen. This man, Philip of Hesse, and another leader, the Elector of the Palatinate, gather forces and say, look, we're not having this in our territory. And they come in and they drive Sickingen back to his castle. Sickingen dies of a bullet wound. I think it's kind of ironic. You know, he's this great knight, but he dies of a modern weapon death. He dies of a bullet wound. Hutten escapes to Geneva and dies on an island in Lake Geneva. But that's the end. But again, it shows you that rebellion was not simply a unfounded fear. It was there, and people are very nervous at this time. They're very nervous at what will be the practical effect of Luther's Reformation, and they're scared, especially if you're an elector, especially if you're a person who believes in law and order. You're scared about this not merely being a reformation of doctrine and bringing the gospel back to light, not merely a reformation of bringing people to true repentance. That's what Luther wanted. Luther didn't want farmers to stop being farmers or everybody or blood running through the streets. Luther never had any violence. Luther hated violence. Luther was completely okay to submit to his king in all earthly matters, but not in spiritual matters. Luther wanted a freedom of conscience, not a freedom from his king. And I think that's very clear. Now, to add trouble to this, it's like pouring gas on a fire. And again, the Pope, as we saw last time, wasn't the only one of bad timing. So was Luther. Remember, Karlstadt at first was leading the reforms in Wittenberg, and he goes too far. And in fact, he goes so far that Luther has to come back and preach his sermons to get Wittenberg back law and order, return things to where they should be before they can go too far off the rails. They can't be returned. He doesn't take it well. He leaves the university in 1523. And he goes to the city of Orlamünde, and he starts a puritanical type radical reformation. He continues with his iconoclasm, breaking images, getting rid of crucifixes. He stops wearing clerical garb. He dresses like a farmer. He has people call me Brother Andreas. He ends infant baptism, which again is a terrifying thing to think of, not only from a doctrinal perspective, but very practical. That the infant mortality rate was huge back in the Middle Ages, and that he had children already at this time, and that he wouldn't even baptize his own kid. He denies the real presence of Christ's body and blood in the Lord's Supper. One of the things that we're going to see very clearly here is with these radical reformers and others that Luther will come into contact with, is that they do not, anything that smacks of Catholicism we throw away. But what Luther will say out is not everything in the Catholic Church was wrong, not every teaching was wrong. And what is biblical and must remain biblical. And if it doesn't make sense to us, so be it. God is above our senses, but this guy, again, has that magisterial view of reason. And Christ, the Lord's Supper is a spiritual meal, not a fleshly meal. And he attacks Luther's teaching of the Lord's Supper, that the body and blood of Christ are truly present in, with, and under the bread and wine. And he really starts rabble-rousing. Now, I would say that Karlstadt probably is a more milquetoast kind of radical reformer, a guy who likes to talk tough, but in the end is not really going to do that. The guy that really takes things on is a man named Thomas Muenzer. You see his name spelled a number of ways. Sometimes it's spelled with a T. I've always seen it spelled with just the Z. But he was an early opponent of indulgences. He actually is in Wittenberg around the time Luther's preparing the 95 Theses and discussing the 95 Theses. However, he goes in a very radical bend. He becomes a revivalistic Pentecostal type preacher of Reformation. He gets kicked out of a number of positions. He's wandering for years. He's influenced by the Zwickau prophets. We talked about them last time. And a radical social. He begins to see himself as receiving direct messages of Jesus Christ. And that what Jesus wants is that this be done. There's a funny story told about Charles Spurgeon, the great Calvinistic preacher of London in the 1850s, 1860s, that he came to his church one night for the evening service to preach for that service, and there was a young man there, and that young man said, "God told me that I'm supposed to preach at this church tonight." And Spurgeon said, "Well, then we have a problem, because God already told me I'm supposed to be preaching at this church tonight." And that was Spurgeon's way of, very humorous, saying, is I have a call from this congregation to be up there and preach tonight. You do not. This man was so filled with himself that he said that trumps everything. And that's the kind of person that Muenzer was. Muenzer is a person who's, I don't know, we can call it maybe narcissism. He's a David Koresh type character. For those of you who remember that horrible tragedy in the early 90s in Waco, Texas, personally, a cult leader type person is what I would say. And unfortunately, people have tried to, rehabilitate this guy historically speaking, like he's an early revolutionary, he's an early patriot. This guy was a nutball. This guy was a guy so full of himself and so disappointed with his own life. But he starts, when everybody says, God has directly told me to do something that the Bible directly tells you not to do, this is not a person we should admire, nor is a person we should listen to. He ends up in a city called Allstadt, and he begins preaching a radical social revolution. So he says that to be a true gospel preacher, we need to rip open this whole fettered thing and let sunlight come in. And I'm going to have a quotation from one of his sermons in just a bit. And you're like, oh, this is bad. This is bad stuff. So this is the problem that Luther is facing when he gets back to the Wittenberg. On the one side, you got people like Duke George, who say if you let the Catholic faith go, you invite insurrection. And this is always, always, always the attack on Luther. This is what Reformation will bring. Reformation will bring disorder. Now, I think that is an absolute stupid thing to say, as if there was never, ever a peasants' revolt before the Reformation, as if no one ever rose up and went against their masters before. This is a problem that you're going to have in any sinful world when people with a lot and who are oppressing and who are tyrannical have. If you read the history of Athens, if you read the history of Rome, if you read the history of just any civilization, It's something that constantly happens. And to blame it on Luther's Reformation doctrine is absolutely silly. It was a problem that was there before Luther got there. It's a problem after Luther is there. It's a problem that will persistently happen. We have probably the least religious society in my lifetime living right now, and it's more ripe for insurrection and for social upheaval than any time in my life I can remember. Even more so in some cases than even in the 1960s. On the other side, you got somebody like Muenzer who looks at Luther and says, you're a wuss, you're a milquetoast, half measures. Let the Catholic faith be destroyed so the new pure order might be born. And this is what I call that progressive mindset. I don't like progressive politics in any way, shape, or form, because progressive politics has this apocalyptic idea that if I get rid of you and I get rid of you and I get rid of all the people I've designated are the problems, we're going to usher in this grand new beautiful era where everything is going to work right. And I say, holy cow, people have tried that. And the only thing that happens when people try to bring that into reality is millions of people die. Hitler, Stalin, Mao. Look at Stalin and Mao. Just alone, 60 million people apiece. Luther looks like Hitler looks like a minor leaguer by comparison. And so I tell people, be very careful about this kind of thing. The French Revolution too. Declaring all these rights and things like that. You look at the kind of blood that flowed under people like Robespierre and people like that. You have to be careful about this. These people are very, very dangerous, and both of them. One is saying nothing should ever change. Everybody's saying everything should ever change, and Luther says you're both wrong. Now, if you want to see the true issue, I think this is a good illustration of the problem between this man and this man. And it comes from the movie Reds. And if you ever see the movie Reds, I think movie Reds is a great movie. It's one of my favorite movies. It's not a Christian movie by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a great movie, excellent acting. But this is probably one of my favorite scenes from that movie. And it's a scene later in the movie between Louise Bryant, played by Diane Keaton, and Eugene O'Neill, the great playwright, great American playwright. And she has just come back from Russia. Her husband, Jack Reed, he's still in Russia. He's still joining the revolution. He's still excited about the revolution in Russia. And she's back, giving speaking tours. And these two used to have a relationship. And so she wanders up to his hotel room and he lets her in. And she says this to him: "Oh, Gene, if you had been to Russia, you'd never be cynical about anything again. You would have seen the people transformed, ordinary people." Eugene O'Neill, Louis, something inside me tightens when American intellectuals' eyes shine. And they start to talk to me about the Russian people. Wait. Something in me says, watch it. A new version of Irish Catholicism is being offered for your faith. Now, I don't know who wrote the screenplay for Reds, but that is spot on. You see, ultimately, the Catholic prince says, we have the vision and we've established it, and that's what it must be. We've already gotten there. And the progressive says, no, this is what the vision is, and it's going to be, and we're going to get there and establish that. And anybody who gets in the way, we'll kill. Both are really two sides to the same coin. Okay. Luther says you're both wrong. And I would say a lot of Luther's ideas here really filter into modern political. Unfortunately, those ideas are fading fast in our current day and age. But this is what Luther would say to both of those. Now, to George, he would say, I'm ready to die to preach the pure gospel to the world. Now, Luther insists on freedom of conscience. Luther insists that I don't care what you say. I will be obedient to your body, but you cannot put a shackle on my soul. You cannot kill me. And if that's the price for me to be faithful to the word of God, I willingly pay it. And that is an attitude every Christian should have. I will be faithful to my king. I will pray for him. I will do it. Thomas More, who ultimately is an enemy of Lutheran theology, but he says something very, very right on the scaffolding before he is executed. You tell the king I was his good servant, but I'm God's first. And I think that's, he dies with a very Lutheran ideal. I'm the king's good servant, but I'm God's first. And Luther would say, look, I am your good servant, but I'm God's first. And I'm actually being a better servant to you by doing it. Matt Harrison, the president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, when he was testifying before Congress about some of these conscience violations of religious employers that are being put on because of the American Affordable Care Act, said, we make great citizens, but you have no right to tell us what we are to believe, and you have no right to violate our conscience. And that's exactly the Lutheran view. He says, I don't want to be here. I'm happy letting you do your job. Let me do mine. But you're not letting me do my job. You're getting in the way of us preaching our gospel. Now, that doesn't mean he has Muenzer side. To Muenzer, he would say something like this: I will never kill for the gospel. Luther looks at this man and says, you are playing with fire, and I want no part of what you're doing. That is still the king. It is still the prince. God has still endowed him with authority, and we are to obey him. If he owe taxes, you give him taxes. I think what's interesting, if you read especially the prison epistles of Paul, how much Paul asks for people to pray for people like Nero. I urge you, first of all, that prayers for kings and those in authority should be offered. He's praying. He urges them to do that while he's in prison. He doesn't say, rise up and kill Caesar. You find that nowhere. He appeals. Paul appeals to his Roman citizenship. You think of what Jesus says: give to Caesar what's Caesar's. Give to God what's God's. I can be a good citizen to my country and still have my heart first and foremost to God. There isn't a contradiction between those two. And what we begin seeing emerge is the Lutheran doctrine of the two kingdoms. We owe obedience to God's governing authorities. Rebel against them and you get what is coming to you. However, we owe obedience to our conscience to preach and to live the gospel according to the word of Christ. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God's what is God's. Let me use this current COVID-19 issue to maybe illustrate that. Now, we've shut down our school. We do distant learning. We don't let more than 9 people in here at a time. We've obeyed the governing authorities because he is our governing authority. He's looking out for the welfare of the state, and we owe him that obedience to the welfare of the state. That being said, when the government says to me, your church is unnecessary, you shut the doors, lock the doors, I'm not going to do that. I'm not saying that that's what's happened here, but if they said, well, we believe it's in fact, well, we're gonna ticket you if you come into your office, Pastor Meitner, and if you give the Lord's Supper, if you get in your car and go give the Lord's Supper to somebody and violate the state harm order, well, then you can give me a ticket. Um, um, I'm obeying and I'm keeping law, but you have no right to tell me to stop the means of grace. That's what I'm called, and the church is essential. And the church has always acted as it's essential because it is, because people need the gospel even more so in times like this than before. So, again, we answer yes to both questions and no to both questions. I'm not looking to overthrow the governing authorities of California, but the governing authorities of California do not have the right to tell me you can't preach the gospel and you have to obey what we tell you. The governing authorities have no right to dictate my beliefs and dictate what God's word says. So that's Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms. Now, Luther has a nice word for Muenzer and people like him. He calls them Schwaermer. And the picture of that is hornets or bees or gnats or mosquitoes or whatever annoying insect of your choice buzzing around your head. That they're just filled with their own vigor, preaching whatever they feel, preaching their. But what does God say? You just want to grab somebody like Muenzer, but what does the word of God say? Will you stop telling me what you think? What does God say? Be careful about a preacher who says, I feel, and I feel, and I feel, and I know. What does the word of God say? Pastor Bader, pastor at the Thousand Oaks, he did a remodel of his church when he first got to the church, and on the pulpit it says, "Sir, we would see Jesus." And I think that's a great thing to say. In the front of our pulpit, you have the shield of St. Paul, the sword of the Spirit, and the word of God, Spirit Gladius, the sword of the Spirit. And those are reminders to the preacher that you're not there to talk about your feelings or your take on things. You're there to show people this is what God said. Pastor Weedman, who was my associate and was pastor here for many years before his retirement, I always was tickled pink by how what he would say to the congregation after he read the text he was going to expound upon. he would just look deeply into the eyes of the congregation, and with the great solemnity, he would say, "These are God's words. What I'm about to tell you are not my words, not my ideas. These are God's words." And that always hit me. It was always very special to me. And the Schwaermer are different. These are my words. This is what I'm going to tell you. And this kind of unfettered emotionalism. Now, Luther begins to go after these guys. Luther says these guys are dangerous. They're dangerous to the Reformation. They're dangerous to law and order. They're dangerous to the gospel. And so Luther just doesn't just grab anybody around. Luther says, no, I have one standard. What does the Word of God say? And I don't care if you were my supporter at Worms. If you're wrong, you're wrong. And I don't care if the Catholic priest is Catholic prince is Catholic. If he's right on matters of law and order, I will support him in matters of law and order. Luther is the exact opposite of what we find in most of our politicians and political parties today, that we tend to overlook the sins of people who share our political ideals, and we tend to castigate those who don't have our political ideals for the same sins. Luther holds one standard to all people. And he doesn't care if it doesn't work for him politically. He doesn't care if it doesn't play well in Peoria. He says, this is what God says. So he looks at what Karlstadt's doing. It's against Scripture, so he goes after it. The first thing he does is he writes a letter to the Saxon princes, and he names both Karlstadt and Muenzer as dangerous radicals. These are people you cannot have fomenting rebellion in your land. It's very dangerous. That's 1524. At Jena, Luther calls out Muenzer directly in a sermon he preaches there, and Karlstadt indirectly. Karlstadt's in the audience for that. This leads to a very famous confrontation between the two in 1524. Luther perhaps overstepped his bounds, the bounds of the Eighth Commandment in that sermon, and I think that Karlstadt perhaps was correct. Luther probably should not have been as direct. It's not a good idea to talk about someone in such a way, even if you don't mention the name directly, if everybody knows who you're talking about. But again, Luther looks upon what Karlstadt's doing as a threat to the gospel. That's not a justification for any sin of Luther, but that's his mindset. Karlstadt finally does do enough revolutionary activity that he gets himself kicked out of Saxony in 1524. What's funny is that Luther still houses him in his house for about 11, 12 days in 1525, even though it's against the law. But he has pity on him because of the pathetic circumstances he and his family and his children have fallen into because of his recklessness. Luther writes against Karlstadt's view of the Lord's Supper in 1526. His view of the Lord's Supper is kind of funny. Karlstadt says, when Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, said, "This is my body, take and eat." Just, it's almost laughable. Again, what I like to stress about Karlstadt is a guy I think who was envious of Luther. I think he was envious of the popularity, but not a very bright man, and a man who envy overtook his good sense and took him in directions he shouldn't. Karlstadt ends up okay, not good theologically, but okay. He really loses any good standing. He ends up in the city of Basel, and pretty much where he started from. He ends up in the city of Basel as a professor of theology in the city of Basel. He ends up in the Reformed camp, not Lutheran, but the Reformed camp. And he dies there early 1540s. But he does put away his rebellious ways to a certain extent. I think he does see the error of his ways, and kind of ends it where it does. That cannot be said about the next man. Muenzer and the Peasants' Revolt. Muenzer preaches a radical rebellion, and Muenzer, I would say, must have been a pretty good speaker. He could really rile people up. Between late 1524 and 1525, there are many separate rebellions that are taking off all over places. And again, not merely in Lutheran lands. This isn't just happening in Saxony, it's happening all over the Holy Roman Empire. Even in the lands that are solidly Catholic, it's happening. The Catholic princes and Catholic clergy will use it as, aha, that's that Lutheranism, let's kill it. To this day, southern Germany is still very Catholic. There are pockets of Lutheranism in southern Germany. My family, for instance, part of my mother's family came from a part called Franconia, which was a Lutheran enclave in southern Germany. But outside of that, it's very Catholic, because I think the hammer was brought on so hard during the Peasants' Revolt in 1524, 1525 that by and large most peasants said this religion thing isn't worth it. We'll just stay Catholic. In Muehlhausen, Muenzer is received as a prophet. and he preaches murder and fire. Basically, he preaches genocide to all the masters and all the Catholic clergy. This is a quotation from one of his sermons. Go, go, go. Show no mercy, though Esau may suggest kind words. Don't consider the lamentations of the godless. They shall beg you as friends, crying and pleading as children. Don't let mercy prevail. Go, go, go. While the fire is hot, forge. Hurl the tower down to the ground. Don't let your sword seeped in blood cool off. Go while it is day. Now, Luther has taken a hit for his very, very open against the murdering hordes of peasants on the pamphlet he publishes to encourage the prisoners to put this down with the sword. And said, oh, he's too hard. Look, maybe he was too hard, but look at also what is being preached. And by the way, people were dying. People were getting murdered in their bed. And to a certain extent, you started something. When I first moved to LA, there was a policeman by the name of Christopher Dorner, or a former policeman named Christopher Dorner, who went on a murderous rampage in the city of Los Angeles, and he ended his life up near Big Bear, I believe. He'd driven up into the mountains, and he had barricaded himself in a house, and that house was ultimately set on fire, and he was shooting, and when it was all done, people said, well, did he have to be burned alive? Did he, couldn't we have talked him out? And I said, well, of course, I don't think any policeman wanted that to happen. Okay. That being said, you can't open up on police officers and kill and murder without discrimination, and then expect concessions when the tables turn on you. And so, although Luther may have been too strong in his language, and although the taking down of the Peasants' Rebellion is quite violent, don't forget what started it. I think you have to keep that into consideration. Luther does respond, and perhaps his most angry polemic, he urges the governing authorities to quell the rebellion with the unmerciful use of the sword. It basically says, look, peasants, if you don't want to die, put down your stuff and go back doing your work. Go back to your vocation. The armies of Saxony, Hesse, and others do just that. The rebellion is put down, and it's put down pretty violently. It's put down in a way that no one will think to do it again. So, you can argue with it, but you don't coddle rebellion. I know there are a lot of people who say, well, Luther was upset by how bad it was, and I agree it was. Luther was tender-hearted. And again, I don't think anybody likes to see bloodshed, but at the same time, that when people rebel against the governing authorities, the Lord warns us in the fourth commandment what happens. Honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you, and you may have a long life on the earth. God's being pretty clear. In the end, Luther is kind of left out in the cold. This does blacken Luther's name in a number of ways. The Catholic princes used Luther as the scapegoat for the whole mess. See, if it hadn't been for Luther, this would have never happened. I think that's silly, and I think even people that they knew that this was a deeper issue than Luther. This was an issue that was there before Luther. It's an issue that comes up after Luther again. But he's a convenient scapegoat, and the peasants, and especially in southern Germany, especially in Saxony, do in some way feel betrayed. But I blame that more upon the false preaching of men like Karlstadt and Muenzer than I do on Luther. Luther at no point has Luther ever advocated any of this. Luther has advocated a return to the gospel and to get rid of things that are contrary to the gospel. But law and order is not contrary to the gospel. Being faithful to your prince is not contrary to the gospel. Luther was aiming at things like, forced clerical celibacy and forced confession, and people being told that in order to get into heaven, you have to do everything you can do within you, rather than receiving the gift of Jesus Christ. He wasn't aiming at taxes. The truth is that Luther struggled to take the narrow scriptural road between these two poles. And Lutherans are always kind of held out to dry because we're accused of quietism. We're not being quietistic. We believe that the biggest way we can change the world is by taking up the vocations God has given us and to carry them out to the end faithfully, and that to preach the gospel and to carry out our vocation. That's how we change the world. We do not change the world by shaking pieces of paper or unsheathing swords and killing people. That doesn't change the world at all. I like to point out to people, for all the revolutions we've had in the world, what has changed? You know, you can get rid of the Romanovs, but how many peasants in Russia um, had it worse after the Romanovs left? Look at the Great Famine in Ukraine of the 1930s, 20s, and 30s, where millions and millions of people died because of the socialistic experiment. The peasants thought they couldn't have it any worse under the czars. They were wrong. The peasants in China thought they couldn't have it any worse under the emperor system. They were wrong. You have to kind of put that. And Luther's point simply is that the world is the world, and you're never going to make it a heaven on earth. And the best we can do is to be obedient to governing authorities. The only time we are not obedient to governing authorities is when they demand us to violate our conscience. Then we will not. The only time I will refuse ever to violate my conscience to the government, and that means I may suffer. I'm not going to kill, but I will not. I'm willing to die for my beliefs. I'm not willing to kill for them, but I'm willing to die for them. Okay. Now, what's the fallout of the Peasants' Revolt? Well, before the Peasants' Revolt, you kind of have a lot of support for Luther from a lot of different quarters. You have the humanists up at the top here, Thomas More and Erasmus, and you got men like he'll come along later, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli. He's not quite on the scene yet, but you'll have these other reform-minded people who are on the scene. You'll even have Catholic reformers who believe, Luther is on to something. You'll have these elements. But after the Peasants' Revolt, you'll really see a loss of that. The biblical humanists really placed themselves directly under the Catholic authorities. That's not going to turn out too well for them. Not Erasmus, and it's certainly not going to turn out well for Thomas More. You'll have these men going to find princes who will buy into their view of the world and not Luther's vision of the two kingdoms. You'll find very stark walls between those. Lutherans tend to go on their own. Lutherans don't tend to say, well, we'll put aside our biblical ideals and our biblical beliefs for an earthly goal. Lutherans don't do that. Calvinists will do that. Catholics will do that. We don't tend to do that. We will say we'll be obedient to the government. We'll be obedient to the things that belong to the earthly kingdom. We can agree on those things, political things. For instance, Luther believed in what's a political peace, but he never believed in a doctrinal peace. You can't have a doctrinal peace. There is the truth, and then there's error. And I won't accede to error. I will accede to political realities, but I won't accede to error. And so you have some very defined groups in the years to come. And the narrow Lutheran middle between the two kingdoms really comes out of this, that we are faithful to the state, we're obedient to the state, but we're also obedient to our conscience, and we can do both at the same time. The only time we're not obedient to the state is when it demands that we violate our conscience. Then we're willing to die for that. Just to illustrate that, when Luther was first on the scene, 1519, 1520, 1521, 22, Henry is the most Catholic of princes. And he writes a defense of the seven sacraments and asserts papal infallibility, even to such an extent that even Thomas More warns him, perhaps you want to touch on this a little less lightly. And he says, nope, papal infallibility. So he's the most Catholic. He's given the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope for his defense of the papal doctrine. Luther's response is, how shall we say, not very patient with Henry. He considers Henry a buffoon, and he treats him as such in his response to Henry. But anyway, you know the story of Henry and his women and his divorce. And Henry ends up over in this side, and he'll bring the Reformation in, but not the Lutheran Reformation, but tend to be a more reformed Reformation. Well, what happens there? Well, you may remember that when it's clear to Thomas More, his High Chancellor, that Henry is leaving the church and he is going to declare he's going to marry Anne Boleyn and he's going to declare himself the supreme head of the church, More resigns and decides to go live in quietness. And he's not left alone. Henry's bothered by that. And Henry ends up finally persecuting More to the point that More is put to death. If you ever see the play A Man for All Seasons or read about Thomas More, Thomas More, I think, is a man of conscience, but he's also a man who's obedient to the state. Again, it's funny, as bitter an enemy theologically as More is from Luther, they tend to, in reality, behave the way they would behave. What's interesting is Luther's reaction to this whole Thomas More and Henry VIII issue. Thomas More is put to death in 1535. So Luther is still alive when Thomas More is put to death. And it's funny what he says. He basically says of Thomas More, look, you were wrong, Thomas, for refusing the gospel. So your stubborn insistency on the papacy is wrong. The Lord gave you many chances to repent and turn around from that. It was wrong. But he's saying that as I guess a pastor would say to a wayward parishioner who is refusing to repent or come to a knowledge of the truth. It's happened to me many times. You're wrong. I'm not going to say that you're right. You're wrong for refusing the gospel it's held out to you. But what's interesting to me is he has much stronger words for Henry. You were wrong, Henry, for killing a loyal subject who would not violate his conscience. He may be wrong, but you're just as wrong for trying to force him to violate his conscience. You're just as wrong for trying to put him to death, for putting him to death. What are you thinking? Exile him, or put him in prison or whatever you have. But you didn't need to kill him. You used to replace the one tyrant with the Pope with a new kind of tyrant. So you have this idea. And one thing I want to stress about Lutheran lands, the type of bloodshed that happens in Catholic lands for somebody who disagrees with the Catholic hierarchy, or something happens in Geneva for people who disagree with the Calvin's take on the church and the state, or something happens in England under Henry, or later again under his daughter Bloody Mary, never happens in Lutheran lands. If you refuse to stop preaching false doctrine, if you foaming, we'll kick you out of the country, but we don't kill you. You never have the type of bloodshed in Lutheran lands historically that you have in Catholic lands or Reformed lands. And again, it goes back to it's a new version of the same old thing. The narrow Lutheran middle, the biblical way is freedom of conscience, obedience to the structures that God has established. Now, we've gotten through the storm of these 1522 to 1525 years, but now there's a bit of peace. In 1522, a nun writes to him from a convent in Nimschen, and Luther's pamphlets, especially a pamphlet on the freedom of the Christian, has come through, and there's some buzz among the nuns. Are we doing the right thing? And they write to him. And Luther's advice to the nuns is, leave, come to Wittenberg. Don't put yourself under that tyranny for the rest of your life. It would be wrong. Now, Luther himself never really makes use, up to 1525, he's never really made use of the Christian freedom he's advocated. He continues to wear the black cowl of the Augustinian cloister. He continues to live basically as a monk up until the time of his marriage, or a little bit before. He never really takes advantage of any of those things. People say that Luther did the Reformation so that he could be a glutton and a drunkard and do what he wants. You're not paying attention to the life he lived. He was always about the peace of his conscience. And so he says to people who are in the same kind of bind he himself found himself in, the advice that gave him freedom: take comfort in the gospel. You don't need to be in those things. They're false things. Leave them. Well, they listen. And this group of nuns, through an arrangement that Luther works out, hide among herring barrels that are delivered to the convent. They escape on Easter evening, 1523. They sneak out of the convent. They hide among these herring barrels. Why do they have to hide among herring barrels? Well, an escaped nun was a violation of the law, punishable by death. Even though it's a canon law, even though it's a church thing, you weren't allowed to leave. And so they're not safe until they get into Saxon lands. And it creates a little bit of a scandal that these nuns get there. And Luther's first idea is, well, what I'll do is I'll write to their families, and these families can take them. And none of the families want anything to do with it. Many of these nuns were sent to the nunnery not for religious reasons as much as for monetary reasons. For instance, Katharina von Bora, who is one of the nuns, she's from minor nobility, minor Saxon nobility, but they'd fallen on some hard times, and they didn't want to pay for her. Also, the dad had married a new mother, and the new mother wanted nothing to do with the daughter of the previous wife, and so send her to a nunnery, as the phrase from Hamlet goes. And so they do, and so she escapes, and Luther Luther tries to get them at the, so it's, well, next thing is I find them husbands. And so Luther boards all these nuns out in various places, and encourages people to find husbands. Now, Katharina von Bora is one of the nuns. She's actually, for a time, lives in the house of the famous painter Lucas Cranach, who does many of the paintings, the early paintings of Luther, and who was a very noted court a portrait artist throughout Northern Europe, and very famous. Runs a very successful studio in Wittenberg. He is one of the people that houses one of the nuns for a while. She also, I believe, another source I saw, he lived among the city secretary. She lived with the family of the city secretary for a while as well. A couple matches are made. One seems very promising, but when the man goes back to tell his parents, they aren't too thrilled with him marrying an escaped nun, so it kind of goes to the kibosh. And Katharina can't seem to find someone. Now, Katharina is a very beautiful woman. I think she's a very pretty woman. She has beautiful red hair. I think even in the pictures that we have of her, she is quite attractive. Um, and but she's a noblewoman, so some people are a little like, well, she's kind of uppity. She's very outspoken. She is very strong-willed. And so, Barbara, the wife of Lucas Cranach, works her tail off to try to find a match, but she can't seem to find one. And so basically by 1525, all of the escaped nuns have found husbands except Katharina von Bora. And they're what do we do with this girl? We can't find a match for her. And they approach her and say, well, what are we going to do here? We can't seem to find a match. Nobody seems to suit your ideals. And she says, very matter-of-factly, there are two men I will marry. I will marry Professor Amsdorf, or I'll marry Professor Luther, Dr. Luther. Now, Nicholas von Amsdorf was Luther's good friend and drinking buddy, if you will. Nicholas von Amsdorf is a devout bachelor, and there is no way Nicholas von Amsdorf is going to marry. It was not a real suggestion, I don't think. And I think she only brought his name up to maybe encourage Amsdorf to encourage Luther to say yes. And Luther's a little bit taken back by that. Luther doesn't propose marriage to her as much as is told that she has proposed marriage to him. But Luther thinks of it, and he thinks about his father, and he thinks about having a family, and he says, well, I suppose I should put my money where my mouth is. It's interesting that Luther's companion, Luther's second in command, Melanchthon, is absolutely dead set against this marriage to Katharina von Bora. In fact, he is not even at the wedding, which I think is a little bit of a slight to Philip. Katharina never likes Philip. Philip never likes Katharina. There's a great distance between the two. I think it is a little bit of a sadness that after Luther's death, Philip doesn't really do much for the widow of Luther. There was always a little bit of a hard feeling, I think, between that. But anyway, they get married, and here's a picture of her on her wedding day, and this is a picture of him on his wedding day. These are painted, and they're married in the home of Lucas Cranach, and they're married by Bugenhagen, who is the town priest, the town preacher, Luther's good friend. Bugenhagen's wife, Walpurga, becomes a very good and very close friend of Katharina von Bora. So Amsdorf, Justice Jonas is there, George Spalatin is there as well. He receives a wedding gift from the elector of the Black Cloister, now is his personal home, and he receives some money as well. And so it is a welcome family. And there's funny stories about Luther's the day before Luther's wedding. He hadn't changed his sheets in a year, and he looks around. He says, I probably should clean this up before I have a woman up here. He talks about the morning after his marriage. He says it was just such a weird out-of-body experience to turn next to you and see these little red pigtails, on the pillow next to you, and that's all. Luther's a very sensitive man, and when he sees this, it's kind of neat. She is a phenomenal woman in many ways. Um, they are married for 21 years until his death in 1546, and her devotion to him is legendary. Luther would have died in poverty, or would have died many years earlier had it not been for the supreme care. She does a masterful job managing his finances. In fact, she is notorious for hiding money from Luther, because Luther would just give away money. Luther, he lived in the church so long, he just never thought about money or things like that. Somebody else always thought of that for him. So she would hide money. She was the one responsible. Um, he would have funny and pet names for her. The master of the swine. He would call her Master Katie, because she did run the house, and she made sure his finances worked well. And there is a genuine love that develops between these two, a genuine love, and she is extremely devoted to him, and he devoted to her as well. She gives him a number of children: Hans, Elizabeth, who dies at 8 months, Magdalena, who dies at 13 years. That's one of the sad stories. When Magdalena dies, Luther goes into a deep depression, and has a very hard time coming out of it. He's very close to Magdalena when she dies, and there's some very famous stories about how deep a depression he goes into and what she does to get him out of it. Martin, who becomes a pastor, a theologian, uh, not really of his father's stature, but solid pastor and theologian. Paul, by far, is the most famous of Luther's children. Paul becomes the court physician for the elector, and a very famous and a very respected physician throughout Saxony. And then Margareta marries into nobility. She becomes a noblewoman through marriage. She also did suffer a miscarriage in 1539, which I think is a little impressive. She's 40 at that time, and Luther's 56. So, um, you know, uh, certainly they enjoyed each other's company. In addition to their own children, they raised 4 orphan children, and including Katharina's nephew, Fabian. So she has a very large heart. I think it's something that you have to say about Katharina. She had a very large heart, a lot of patience. Luther probably was not a very easy man to work with and live with. He'd been a bachelor for so many years. He's 42 years old when he gets married, and yet she does make that marriage work very well. Other things I think we can say about her. Here's her later in life. This is around the time of Luther's death. She provided stability during these stormy years. She gave him children and became, I think, what we can really say is the first prototypical pastor's wife. And I know a lot of times, in our age of feminism, people look at pastors and look down upon pastors' wives. I don't think being a pastor's wife requires that you have to play the organ or teach Lutheran grade school or be at every ladies' aid meeting. But I have to say this from personal experience. I don't know I could do what I do without the support and love of my wife. I just don't think I can do it. It would be very difficult without having somebody who you always know has your back, and that's extremely important. And so, I think I can speak for all pastors, at least that I've worked with and known over the years, who will say hands down the thing that allows them, next to Jesus, to keep going throughout the ups and downs of the ministry, is their wife. She was an excellent businesswoman, as I've said. She was an excellent nurse. There is some anecdotal evidence that she had some training in apocryphy. She was an apothecary, maybe some training she'd received at the nunnery, because she, through her home remedies and through her excellent care of Luther, probably allowed him to live 10 years longer than he would have lived as a bachelor. I'm quite certain Luther would have died in his early 50s, most likely, had it not been for her great skill and care. If you want to, it's kind of I just came across this recently, but there is a movie on Luther and his wife, and it's very well done. It's in German. You have to watch it with subtitles, of course. And it came out in 2018, and it's called Luther and I. I think another title is Katharina, but you can find it on Netflix or Amazon or something like that. But I think it gives you a very good insight into their marriage and what it must have been like for her as a former nun, marrying him as a former monk, and how they built their life together. But she was a blessing, great blessing to his work. So that brings us up to 1525. So we have about 3 sessions left. I'm really only going to take this course up to about 15:30. There's a lot more things I could talk about Luther, but this is focusing simply on the Reformation and the discoveries he made and how that he made that stick in the years to come. And I think when we get to 15:30, we pretty much have it settled and set in stone. But we have about 3, maybe 4 sessions left. But I encourage you to stick with me. We're getting close to finishing up this wonderful course. But thank you for joining us again today, and God be with you. We'll see you again for the next session.